in our ongoing series from the Department of History and Archaeology. And this afternoon, we are very privileged and pleased to have with us Miss Rose Miyonga. Miss Rose Miyonga. And Miss Rose Miyonga is going to talk to us or present a paper that she calls Mau Mau as History of Emotions. In fact, it's a question, and I like the question because questions are potent. They can lead us anywhere. So that is not a statement, it is a question. I hope I'm right. It says, Mau Mau as History of Emotions. And this is part of the ongoing series titled Reevaluating Archaeological Knowledge, the Minimalist State, and Regeneration of Society in Kenya. We've been running this for a while now. And without preempting, of course, what our speaker plans to discuss this afternoon, I think it's common knowledge that Mau Mau is not one history, but many histories. It has multiple narratives. It has texts and subtexts. We talk about or we hear about reluctant rebels, for example. We hear of Mau Mau as a crucible. We talk about, or Lon still talks about, the Mau Maus of the mind. So to have our speaker speak to us this afternoon about Mau Mau and as a history of emotions, I think is very advantageous to us because it is not a path that is much trodden. Now, Ms. Miyonga is a PhD candidate in African history at the University of Warwick. She holds a BA and MA from University of Leeds, University College London. And in this presentation, Ms. Rose Miyonga argues that Mau Mau history holds an emotional potency unlike any other topic in Kenyan history. At the same time, she argues, among the survivors, and we still do have survivors of the Mau Mau, or from the Mau Mau era, we have their descendants as well. The war is also as much emotional as it is a historical connection, and therefore there is an intersection of personal experience and national history. I think that's the trajectory of this presentation. And she posits that historians, however, have yet to investigate the Mau Mau War itself through a lens of emotion. And that, I think that's the key to our presentation this afternoon. Mau Mau through the lens, a lens of emotions. Or to explore it in any real depth, the profound emotional dimension to Mau Mau history and memory making in Kenya. So in my mind, this is already an exciting prospect that we get to hear about Mau Mau, the potency of emotions in Mau Mau history. So welcome, Ms. Miyonga, and you can speak to us. Thank you.
Is the mic working? Okay. Could we pull up the PowerPoint? Okay. Good afternoon, and thank you so much for having me to the seminar. I'm great. for inviting me to speak to you all. And thank you to everyone for taking time out of your busy days to come and hear me talk. And I'll try and make it worth your while. So today I'm going to present on my ongoing PhD work on Mau Mau in Kenya. Specifically, I'm going to present a methodological intervention into the historiography, which takes a history of emotions approach to Mau Mau, and which asks questions more broadly about how we can integrate and understand emotions as part of the process of history and memory making. As I'm sure you all know, but it's worth reiterating, the field of Mau Mau historiography is broad and vast. Last year's conference, which marked the 70th anniversary of the declaration of the state of independence, of the state of emergency in Kenya, showed how much innovative research has been conducted on the topic of Mau Mau, and also how rich the field of ongoing research is. And what the conference reminded me also is how deeply emotive Mau Mau was and continues to be. Those of you who were there will remember how thick the room felt with emotions at some points. Among academics and Mau Mau survivors and descendants, feelings mingled in a heady swell that made for a fantastic and rich conference. In my research, I asked the question, what if we look at these emotions, not dismiss them as incidental, but take them seriously as historical sources and actors in their own right? How could a feelings approach to Mau Mau lead to new historical understandings? And can we go to the next slide, please? Mau Mau history holds an emotional potency unlike any other topic in Kenyan history. Discussions of Mau Mau and its place in national history drew the guild historians of this department to blows in the 1980s, and historical debates continue to invoke intense emotions. At the same time, among the survivors and their descendants, the war is as much emotional as historical, connecting at the intersection of personal experience and national history. However, historians have yet to investigate the Mau Mau War itself through the lens of emotions, or to explore in any real depth the profound emotional dimension to Mau Mau history. The work I present today aims to write into that gap and to bring emotions into the discourse as a point of study in their own right. Drawing on oral histories with Mau Mau survivors and their families, and a variety of archival sources, this paper investigates the notion of Mau Mau as a history that has been profoundly shaped by individual and collective feelings, and has in turn the power to invoke powerful affective community. Can we take the next slide? Thank you. As I've already mentioned, this paper draws on my ongoing PhD thesis research, which centers around oral histories with Mau Mau survivors in central Kenya, primarily in Nyeri County. And I should note that some of the names of the research participants have been changed to protect their identities. I also draw from archival sources at the Kenya National Archives in Nairobi and also the UK National Archives in London. Emotions can be quite slippery to pin down, but I have the privilege of being able to ask my research participants specific in-depth questions about how they feel now and how they felt in the past. And working with interpreters, because my Kikuyu is somewhat basic, I'm able to investigate very carefully and systematically to understand and name emotions, and the emotions that have been most important in the memory and history making of Mau Mau. Similarly, in the archives, I look for the material to speak for itself in terms of emotions. I was surprised to find how emotionally rich the archival documents can be. They're littered with descriptions not only of what people were doing, but also of how they felt during the Mau Mau period and afterwards. And by triangulating my oral sources with archival sources, I hope I'm able to build a rich and methodologically strong argument for Mau Mau as history of emotions. One of the principal lines of investigation in my research is about the ways Mau Mau was remembered in post-independence Kenya. Why was Mau Mau shrouded in a veil of public silence and selective amnesia? And was this national silence reflected on a communal and an individual level? Many of the esteemed colleagues in this department remember firsthand the conspicuous silences of the decades following the end of the Mau Mau War. And I'm sure many of you have insights into the reasons behind this, so I look forward to picking your brains in the discussion later. My contention is that feelings played an important role in these silences. Fear, in particular, determined how and where people could speak, and more often could not speak about Mau Mau's past. So I'm interested in what we can learn from looking at emotions as historical phenomena in their own right. Let's take, for example, fear. Fear, I argue, has been a driver of the course of Mau Mau history and also the processes of history making around Mau Mau since the end of the war. The British government's brutal counterinsurgency relied not only on military tactics, but also on the instrumentalization of fear to keep Kenyan citizens, and especially those that they deemed to be potential rebels, in line. Similarly, the task of carefully managing white settler anxieties was a key part of the colonial administration's work to ensure the cooperation of white settler communities without generating a kind of panic that would totally crash their society. From this perspective of Mau Mau adherence, fear was also a potent driver of action. And interestingly, for those of us who look at post-independence Kenya, of public silence as well. Finally, and here I hope that some of the members of this department might be able to speak to this further, fear swirled around the public hallways of government, academia, and journalism in post-independence Kenya, and profoundly impacted the way that Mau Mau was discussed and historicized in the post-independence political center. Fear became a central emotion around which constituencies of Mau Mau survivors organized their memories and participated in history making. In order to explore this, I investigate three different, though at points interconnected, dimensions to the fear-based memory making of the post-war period. One is the apparent silences of Kikuyu people during the Mau Mau era and in the aftermath of the war. The second is the British propaganda campaigns, and later their archival theft and destruction. And the third is the Kenyatta government's heavy-handed amnesia campaign. Mau Mau adherents, Kikuyu loyalists, colonial officials, and later KANU ministers all feared the repercussions that speaking about Mau Mau might have. And these respective groups all ultimately chose not to remember in public and to construct histories protected by a veil of silence that could only be penetrated by the closest confidants. As such, fear worked to silence the processes of history making, both from above and from below, pushing them underground. And this fear defined Kenya's Mau Mau history as one that would be part of an intimate space rather than a history that was shared in the public sphere. And it also marked Mau Mau history as one that was more about silence and absence than it was about open forms of remembrance in the post-independence era. And for British colonial administrators preparing for their hasty exit from empire, an anxiety about how Britain's international public image would reflect, and the potential abuses, how the revelation about potential abuses carried out during the war might be weaponized by the incoming post-independence government, motivated archival theft and destruction. Similarly, for the KANU under Kenyatta, fears of resurgence of radical politics from a disenfranchised public and a concern about the political and economic future of Kenya determined a policy of careful silences and political amnesia about Mau Mau. And additionally, the anxieties about retribution, especially from those members of the government who had vocally opposed Mau Mau, meant that the less that was said about Mau Mau, the better. For those who had experienced Mau Mau most intimately, both Mau Mau adherents and loyalists, retribution was also a preoccupation, and the feelings of despair in the wake of mass violence and the fear of its resurgence encouraged people to practice their history only in the most intimate spaces and to remain publicly silent. So for basic emotions theorists, fear is one of the universal human emotions, which means it's consistent across culture and time. Neurobiologists say they can measure and observe the emotion we understand as fear as an activation in the amygdala and associated bodily responses. For historians of emotion, fear is less certain. While in general, it's understood to have certain physio-psychological parameters, it is also socially constituted and culturally defined. Thus, this paper looks at fear not as one fixed emotional experience, but as a constellation of feelings, and it explores the historical, social, and political actions connected to that constellation of feelings. So on the one hand, we have the mortal fear of violence and death experienced by Mau Mau adherents. And then on the other hand, we have the administrative concern in quotes about, quote, Kikuyu deviance in Kenya in the late 1950s and early 60s. And then on the other hand, we have the perhaps legitimate paranoia about retribution after the end of the war. That's just to illustrate sort of the different dimensions to what we might understand within the constellation that I'm broadly referring to as fear. So taking a sociological approach to fear, this paper explores how the emotion in various manifestations became a key actor in early endeavors to produce Mau Mau history. As Miles Osborne observed, British propaganda around the Mau Mau during the state of emergency was dominated by fear and the attempts to harness that fear into political gain. This paper builds on such work, demonstrating how fearful emotions on all sides of the war continued to be historical actors in the period after the emergency, and would come to define how Kenya's Mau Mau past was recorded at the dawn of independence. These emotions took on different forms, but they were shared by Mau Mau and ex-detainees, by loyalists, by Europeans in Kenya in the 1950s and 60s. And they were stoked up by rumors as well as by painful memories of the past. And these fears were central to how Mau Mau was constructed, as central to how Mau Mau history was constructed as the conflict drew to an end. Fear essentially is an emotional thread that runs through history, one which was essential to the culture of secrecy and silence that emerged during and after the war, and motivated active suppression of public history making and communal memorial practices. For those who put their allegiance in the Mau Mau, the fear of further suppression and punishment encouraged them to remain silent. For European settlers and for politicians both in Britain and in Kenya, anxieties about the already battered international political reputation of British colonialism motivated them to stay silent and to destroy and steal evidence of their most atrocious actions. And this created an archival absence within Kenya that also limited the reach of academic historians within this country. And then for former Home Guards and loyalists, retribution was an immediate fear. So publicly forgetting the events of the 1950s felt safer than any active remembrance. And this tendency towards public forgetting was shared by Kenya's post-independence government, who feared that Mau Mau memories might derail their plans for political stability and prosperity. So let's begin at the grassroots. My research participants spoke frequently about how their experiences of the Mau Mau war were shrouded in a veil of fear. Agnes Waweru, who was a child in the 1950s, described how fear strategies were enacted and how affecting it was, not just to those who directly felt the violence, but also to those who witnessed it and feared the same might befall them. She remembers the deep fear that was instilled in her when she was a child living in an emergency village near Karatina, witnessing a young Mau Mau adherent who was murdered by British soldiers. And here I quote, "Then they tied the boy down. He was dead and they'd already killed him. And then they tied the boy by the legs. And then they put a rope behind the Land Rover and they drive on telling everybody, 'Tell your sons, all of them, to surrender. You can see what we have done to this one. This is what we're going to do to all of them if they don't surrender.'" Agnes explained that she witnessed this happening to a neighbor of hers, a young boy who refused to betray his comrades after he surrendered. Such memories still evoke fear in Agnes, and she shuddered as she related the horrors of witnessing her young friend murdered and dragged behind a Land Rover, while a megaphone blasted out threats. "You surrender or we'll kill all your boys." That her older sister, Phyllis Wanjiku, also described the exact same experience when I spoke to her almost 2 years before, speaks to the intense and pervasive nature of such memories and to the shared affective community of fear that they instilled in those who witnessed and remembered them. This culture of fear was deliberately manufactured by the colonial administration, which sought to use fear tactics to deter Kikuyus from Mau Mau allegiance and to neutralize the insurgency. And this culture of fear, generated through deliberate counterinsurgency tactics, had an effect on the way that people were able to move through the world, and it engendered secrecy and silence. Research participants emphasized the very real danger of revealing your allegiances and activities, and the violent means of suppression used on both sides of the war to ensure silence. Speaking publicly was dangerous. People caught up in the Mau Mau conflict learned to lie or conceal the truth for fear that it would bring violent consequences. Thus, for survivors of the Mau Mau conflict, the culture of fear was linked to a culture of silence. One research participant recalled encountering Mau Mau soldiers one day when she was taking food to her brother, who was a school teacher. On the way, the 9-year-old Esther Wanjira encountered a group of, quote, fearsome Mau Mau soldiers who asked where she was going. Remembering her mother's warnings that if the Mau Mau knew her brother, who was a young able-bodied man, was working as a teacher and not fighting for the Mau Mau cause, they might kill him, Wanjira lied and she told them, the Mau Mau soldiers, that she was going to visit her grandmother. She described how afraid she was of these ferocious soldiers with their dreadlocked hair and their hungry expressions. And she remembered they told her, "Now you're not going to take this food to your grandmother. We are going to take this food to the forest. We are the ones who are fighting for your mothers and fathers. So tell your mother to give you more food and take it to your grandmother tomorrow." Testimonies like these speak not only to the fear of the individual speaker, but they also offer insights into the hard-to-access experiences. For example, the encounter with the Mau Mau fighters does not just illustrate Wanjira's fear, it also speaks to the Mau Mau fighters' fear. They too were risking their lives and they needed secrecy to survive. They were mortally afraid of being discovered by the counterinsurgency forces. Several people spoke of how the Mau Mau fighters put pressure on them to remain silent about anything they knew, And several people used a throat-slitting gesture to exemplify the threats of murder and of violence that were made to anyone who snitched to the British. Thus, the collective experience of fear became both a motivator of violence and also a powerful historical actor during the Mau Mau period. And in many cases, one of the most potent antidotes to fear was silence. So the memories I've just spoken about serve to illustrate the affective tone of the emergency period, one in which fear and secrecy appear almost inextricable, where the fear of mortal peril forged a culture of silence. Fear was the reality of everyday life. As one participant put it, we were fearing those Europeans, we were fearing at the same time the Mau Mau fighters. So those of us who were in the villages were caught in between, and we were fearing those who were in the forest, and at the same time we were fearing the Wazungu. And it's not hard to imagine how this culture of fear continued in post-independence Kenya. All of my research participants remembered President Jomo Kenyatta's now famous forgive and forget speech. Although they could never forget, and many held their resentments close to their chest, they feared that the consequences of speaking out publicly might bring violence or other unpleasantness, and thought it better to heed Kenyatta's words and put the past to rest by staying silent. Similarly, former loyalists feared the threat of retribution and thought forgetting was the best course of action. And I use forgetting in inverted commas because when people say forgetting, they often talk about public forgetting, not about erasing memories. I spoke to several home guards who even now, many decades after the war, were very reluctant to speak about what they had done during Mau Mau, out of a concern for how that information might be received and out of fear that information could be used, how that information could be used in the wrong hands. So in this sense, survivors on both sides of the war are still living with the emotional legacies of the Mau Mau period. And these emotional legacies, I believe, go some way to explain the silence and amnesias of the post-independence years. Archival evidence from how Kenya's post-independence government felt is a little bit harder to find, in part for the very reasons I'm discussing here today, which is that Kenya's Mau Mau past was politically dangerous, and the government feared that discussion of the past could reignite conflict and threaten their political status and the status of the newly independent Kenyan state. However, what is apparent is that discussion of Kenya's Mau Mau past in the early years of independence was highly restricted. Instead, Jomo Kenyatta and his government chose a policy of forgive and forget, words that all of my research participants remember very clearly. Although some were cynical, many research participants discussed the general fears that they felt within communities and expressed in public that those who suffered at the hands of the loyalists, for example, might seek retribution. They described a collective experience of fear and anxiety that was felt at the highest levels of post-independence government and also at the grassroots within communities. Perhaps the most striking example of this is the fact that Mau Mau maintained its legal status as a terrorist organization until 2004. Prohibiting ex-freedom fighters from organizing or meeting to remember their shared past. The government and many citizens feared that discussion of Mau Mau might threaten the hard-won peace and independence of the nation. Just like in wartime, silence seemed to be the solution. Geoffrey Nderitu, for example, expressed to me that to say anything about Mau Mau was risky in the 1960s and 70s because, quote, everyone was scared of what might happen. After over a decade of violent turmoil, It didn't take very much to stop people from talking. Nobody wanted to return to the horrors of the 1950s. Thus, after the war, fear continued to be a motivator for political silence, as well as silence within communities. And this affective environment of fear was a key determinant of how Mau Mau was remembered and historicized within Kenya. And the emotional tone of the British counterinsurgency in the Mau Mau period was also heavily influenced by fear. While white anxieties might have been less founded in everyday reality, the everyday reality of violence and brutality brought images of Mau Mau attacks on white settlers, which played into the collective mindset and fed into a policy of suppression and a fear of anything that might risk igniting Mau Mau activities and sympathies, especially as the forest war drew to a close. Like the people living in forced villages who chose silence as a strategy for self-preservation, white anxieties motivated not only the suppression of subversive political organizing and oathing, but also activities such as singing Mau Mau songs and meeting in groups. As Miles Osborne argues, by 1954, government propaganda had turned towards forgetting. At this point in the forest campaign, villagization and detention meant that Mau Mau propaganda was extremely restricted. Publications aimed at African readerships stopped discussing Mau Mau, and the focus moved on to pro-government propaganda, mainly about development, since the future was deemed to be much safer than the past. And there were also attempts to limit broadcasts that discussed Mau Mau, such as Radio Cairo and later Radio Moscow. And the Kenyan administration even considered jamming the radio signals at one point. And later these anxieties manifested in military activities, such as Operation Milltown, which responded to fears of what they called Mau Mau recidivism, with intensive monitoring and punitive measures. In intelligence files from the late 1950s and early 1960s, former detainees and new emergent political groups such as Kiama Wengi are the people of primary concern, and their activities must, quote, be regarded with suspicion. In intelligence files from this period, the tendency towards silencing and forgetting is explicitly tied to fear. Administrative agents wrote about their anxiety about the potential of Mau Mau oathing turning into re-emergence in the late 1950s, and about their, quote, concerns, which were used to justify both a systematic approach to surveil all ex-detainees with potential Mau Mau sympathies, and to take a potentially violent action against any collective movements related to the Mau Mau. Such anxieties are not only linked to violent Mau Mau resurgence, but also to any public gathering perceived as being related to Mau Mau. Thank you. Such anxieties are linked not only to violent Mau Mau resurgence, but also any public gatherings perceived to be related to Mau Mau. So, for example, in the late 1950s, the government sets up strong policing around singing, prohibiting any songs related to the movement for fear that they might be a sign of or a spark for Mau Mau resurgence. Expressing a white colonialist perspective, the archival material is filled with emotions as administrators describe the, quote, terrorist threat and express a deep fear of retribution against white settlers and loyalists. For example, a briefing from 1960 reported that Anxiety is also being felt by Kikuyu loyalists who fought with the security forces against Mau Mau during the emergency. There have been reports of intimidation by former Mau Mau, and many are said to fear returning to their reserves or wearing their loyalist medals. And last week, a crowd of 200 Kikuyu marched on the gates of a detention camp near Mukuraini, playing musical instruments and singing Mau Mau songs. They were turned away by police and went back quietly to their village, but it is believed that they were trying to hearten Mau Mau hardcore detainees still in the camps. Statements by Mr. Mboya and other African leaders that Jomo Kenyatta will soon be returning from confinement in the Northern Frontier Province are seen by many observers to be an encouragement for those who supported Mau Mau and a matter of concern for loyalists. Excuse the lengthy quote, but I hope you'll find it as interesting as I did. The fact that the Mukuraini group acted peacefully and obeyed police commands does not serve to calm the colonial fears that their songs might hold the power to stir hardcore detainees into rebellion. And these songs still managed to strike enough fear into the hearts of colonial administrators in Kenya that they thought it worth reporting it to their higher-ups in London. In such a context, it seems clear that British conduct in villages in the late 1950s and early 1960s was motivated explicitly by their fears of Mau Mau adherents and their potential for violent protest and retribution. And they turned to policies that silenced any words and songs that might have enlivened Mau Mau sympathies. British media also actively participated in whipping up such fear, reporting frequently on the activities of groups and individuals thought to be linked to Mau Mau in sensationalist terms. On the 3rd of June 1958, the Scotsman ran an article on the Kiamakamuingi practicing cannibalism, feeding into rumors founded in fear and in racial prejudice that had been circling among white settlers in Kenya. Such rumors were an enduring part of the anti-Mau Mau propaganda campaign. On the 6th of July 1960, Alice Lane reported in the Mail that 4 Kikuyu were arrested in Nairobi today for administering or taking a Mau Mau type oath. All 4 who denied the charge were remanded in custody. The case, first in Nairobi since the end of the emergency last January, highlights a situation that has security officials worried. It is known that in the central areas, particularly around Nyeri, 100 miles north of here, full-blooded Mau Mau oaths, including sexual orgies and bestial practices, have been administered recently, and scores of arrests have been made. So these rumors of cannibalism and bestiality and sexual orgies are not substantiated by archival or oral evidence, but they do serve to illustrate the potent mix of fear and misinformation that was swirling around central Kenya as the Mau Mau War was ending and was beginning to transition into history. In 1963, as Kenya entered independent rule, British officials expressed their worries and concerns at the release of J.M. Karaoke's book, Mau Mau Detainee, which in their estimation, quote, whitewashed Mau Mau history, in the sense that it offered legitimacy to the Mau Mau movement and its aims. This was seen as a, quote, threat to the public image of the British colonial rule and to the processes of history and public memory. And this perceived, can you go on back? Yeah. And this perceived threat and associated colonial anxieties was of course linked to a much wider process of cultural loss in the archival theft and destruction now commonly referred to as Operation Legacy. British government officials were so afraid of what the evidence of their brutal conduct could do if it got into the wrong hands in post-independence Kenya, that they embarked on a process of mass destruction and theft of the archival evidence and a process of historical amnesia. Ultimately, Their fears would deeply impact how history came to be remembered and written, and by whom. Of course, colonial anxieties differed from those of Kikuyus under violent counterinsurgency in central Kenya, but they speak to how this broad spectrum of emotions and experiences of fear factored into the silences and secrecy around Mau Mau during and after the war. Thus, we can see that at the grassroots, in the Kenyan political center, and in the British processes of silence and archival theft, fear motivated political action that would come to determine how Mau Mau was remembered and how it was historicized. So, what does a history that looks directly at emotions add to the already crowded field of Mau Mau history? I argue that introducing a feelings-based approach offers value insight to explain groups and individuals' motivations and actions, and it leads to a deeper understanding of how and why Mau Mau came to be historicized as it was. In the example that I've laid out today, understanding the concerns, worries, anxieties, and fears of various historical actors leads to a deeper understanding of why people chose to remain publicly silent about Mau Mau, both during and after the war. And it leads to a richer picture of why the war was remembered and historicized in the way that it was. As a young historian of Mau Mau, I am truly standing on the shoulders of giants. The rich contributions of previous generations have, I believe, created an opportunity for younger researchers like myself to bring new methodological innovations into the already flourishing field. And in attempting to understand the ways that people have felt, as well as what they have done, in attempting to understand the processes of history and memory making as processes of emotions as well as of actions, I believe that we can bring valuable insights into understandings of Kenya's Mau Mau past. Far from this being a soft approach, bringing methodological rigor to the study of emotions in Mau Mau can illuminate our understandings of the event during the war and of the ways that they were discussed and historicized in the post-independence era. So looking, for example, at fear and the way this emotion became a pervasive and instrumental part of the experience of the war and of the post-conflict processes, I've demonstrated that feelings can lend powerful insights to our historical understanding of Mau Mau in post-independence Kenya. Thank you so much for your time, and I'm very eager to hear your questions and your feedback.
Wow. The presentation. Yes, Atieno Odhiambo reminds us that, by the way, his paper called Matunda ya Uhuru. Matunda ya Uhuru. He reminds us that Mau Mau was not the neat conflict of the nationalist imagination. And what our presentation this afternoon confirms is exactly that. That if you want to study Mau Mau as other rebellions or wars, it's very important to look at the subtexts in order to get a more wholesome picture of what you're dealing with. Now, our speaker this afternoon is talking about fear or the emotion of fear, using that as a methodological intervention to look at the Mau Mau. And she's asking a pertinent question. What if we look at emotions as not incidental? Because a lot of times for us, emotions are incidental. What if we look at emotions as not incidental, but as important source of studying history. In this case, the Mau Mau War. So what she has done is to bring emotions into the debate using what she calls the emotional theory that offers different dimensions to that. Now, of course, in her own words, and I agree, fear is a very slippery emotion, very fickle. And as she spoke, I was wondering, how do you measure fear? What is the counterpoint to fear, for example? Here we have rugged freedom fighters with nothing but pangas and a few weapons running against the whole establishment, the British establishment. Is it true to say that then the whole narrative, it was driven by fear? So I think we have an important question there. What is the counterpoint to fear, right? Is there a binary, fear but also courage, so that you have a more balanced outlook? Now, the speaker has also talked about the multifaceted nature of fear. For example, she talks about the silence in post-independent Kenya. I would not call it silence myself. I don't think there has been national silence in regards to the Mau Mau. And if there is, perhaps we need to relook at what silence really means. Because again, silence is a very weighty word. It's very potent. The fact that I'm quiet does not mean, for example, that I agree with you. It could be a form of protest, in my view. So when we talk about these silences as perhaps the other side of the coin of fear, then we need to be very careful about what we mean by silence. But she also, and I think this was important, talks about silence not just on the colonized, but also on the colonizers, that they're also driven to quite some large extent by fear, and this we have seen. And again, in my mind, I thought that, the whole colonial venture was one that survived on intimidation, and if it was going to work, then you had to put the fear of God in those whom you colonized. So in other words, in my mind, and I think she brings this out, fear is not perhaps the exception. It is part of the narrative. It is part of the story. So my question really would be, so when we talk about fear, potency of fear, the emotional fear in the Mau Mau, what is new really? Isn't it perhaps latently agreed that, it is part and parcel of what drives humanity, regardless of whether you're talking about a rebellion, a war like the Mau Mau, and so on and so forth. And by their very nature, rebellions are, of course, driven both by fear, but also insurmountable a courage. And again, and I think you brought this out, but perhaps not as strongly as I would have wanted to think, that even the fighters themselves, they used fear as a weapon. It's not just fear that was meted on them by the colonizers. They also terrorized others. They terrorized the British, they terrorized the villagers, their fellow, and this is why we think of Mau Mau sometimes as a civil war, because again, they use fear for the same purpose as you have explained was being used against them. So again, perhaps we need to look at the other side of the coin to see how that works out. Again, she brought out a very important aspect, the British media, for example, the use of fear, using fear to whip emotions against the freedom fighters. And perhaps the best example, of course, is the mass theft and destruction of the archives. Some migrated and some totally destroyed so that they could manage, the British could manage their own legacy. So, I think this is a very rich dialogue. It can be contested, of course. We are free to do that. But it certainly makes a very pleasant opening to a new debate as to whether we can use emotions as a valid source of history. And listening again to you, in my estimation, perhaps the emotional potency of Mau Mau really lies squarely in its multiple spaces. And if you look at the writings of the Mau Mau, even as it unfolded, right, before it was declared over, the writings were by what you'd now in retrospect call the enemies of the Mau Mau, the settlers, the administrators, and so on and so forth. Arguing, for example, that Mau Mau had no legitimate aspirations and so on and so forth, that Mau Mau was the apotheosis of reason, of unreason. So again, I would worry whether we're not creating a new myth of Mau Mau when we again begin to talk about fear as a potent source that one can use in the study of the Mau Mau. So thank you very much. Those are my observations of our presenter. So we can now open the space for both our audience online and those who are with us in this room. So we shall begin as usual with our audience in the room, and then we shall shift that to those online. So we have Ken. Perhaps we take 3 questions or 4 questions, and then we can go to the online audience. Ken.
Thank you, Rose, for this very interesting discussion on a subject that has generated more heat than light, I think, particularly in the academy. Now, let me just make observations and mix them with some questions. One is, I like what Dr. Ache talked about, silence. Is it silence or selective amnesia of some kind? But it took me back, Maggie, you talk about silence in the political establishment of colonialism and silence on the part of the fighters. And I'm wondering whether we can talk about silence in the academy. And this comes from what I went through as a young man, doing my MA in 1992-93, working, and those of you who are old enough to remember Dr. Prem Narayan, the Indian historian who was in our department. Initially, because I had interest in the Indian political activities during colonialism and all that, and I thought of doing something on either Ambu Patel. Ambu Patel was a very close friend of Mzee Kenyatta, and he's known to have taken somehow care of Kenyatta's family while Kenyatta was in detention or in prison. If not Ambu Patel, then I wanted to do something on Githaral Vidyadhi, the editor of the Colonial Times, who was later jailed by the colonial government because of the sentiments that he had. on Mau Mau and all those. Now, I remember Dr. Narayan telling me, no, don't go there. Don't go there. That is too controversial. And he then took me through a very interesting narrative of the divisions within the Department of History and Archaeology based on Mau Mau. On one side, a group led by the legendary Professor Gott, and the other Maina Wakinyati and the rest, and they said, we don't want to get into those. So then he steered my interest from there, and I ended up doing my MA thesis on Hindu socio-religious organizations in Kenya, a case study of the Arya Samaj community, which my professor considered to be a safe area for me to venture into, other than venturing into characters who are Indian characters who are associated with Mau Mau, Ambu Patel and Gidaral Vidyadhi. Could that be characterized as silence in the academy, so that we have a third, a triad of some kind? On one side, the colonial establishment, and then the fear among the fighters. And here, this is clearly fear in the academy. I could have written something about the Indians and Mau Mau in Kenya. But then I ended up doing something more safer, more cultural, more social, that took me away from, in fact, if you look at my MA project, I mentioned Githaral Vidyati in my concluding chapter, and I remember Dr. Narayan crossing many sections that talked about the relationship between Indians and Mau Mau. Maybe I would need a comment on that. Number two, and a quick one, I was thinking as you spoke, the interaction between what you are calling emotional fear and the laboring that is very common in Mau Mau. You know, we talk of binaries of laboring, the loyalists and non-royalists. Sometimes the civilized and the savages of Mau Mau, the Christians who are civilized, the Christians and traditionalists. And I was wondering how the two interfaced to entrench each other, fear and the laboring of saying you're a loyalist, you are this and that. You know, maybe a comment on that might be very helpful in making me understand this. Now, methodological, I like your boldness because we have been grappling with issues of memory and the history for a while now. You know, if my understanding is well, you know, history is reasoned reconstruction of the past based on evidence. Now, on the other side, you talk about memory, you know, conflated most of the time. The remembered past is transient and discrete, depending on you know, who is remembering, why is remembering, where is remembering, you know, all sorts of things. So what probably you need to think about, and this is my comment, how then do we turn this discrete, this transient, this conflated entity called memory into history that is based on reasoned reconstruction of the human past? You know, maybe those are some of the questions you need to ask yourself. And a small one finally is psychoanalysis helpful in this work? I'm not a psychologist, so but as you talked, I thought you were resonating very closely to psychoanalytical approach to understanding humanity. Thank you.
Oh, thank you very much, Ken. That's quite a handful. You have 3 questions, but I think we also take maybe another 2 so that when she stands, she can deal with them. Have the gentleman over there. You. Okay. So, this one at the back.
Thank you. My name is Mavengo Dennis. I am a photographer and filmmaker based here in Nairobi. I wanted to say to Rose that this is a really good paper and congratulations. I am working on something similar, but one focusing on the Mau Mau fighters from Embu, because that's just one of the things that people never talk about the Mau Mau fighters. We only speak about the Kikuyu fighters, and we forget that there were other people who were involved in the war. And I have been working on the project for the last 2 years. It's a photography project and also a short documentary. So mine is not a question, but mine is to invite all the people attending this, and most importantly, you, Rose, and Dr. Margaret. It's going to be happening on June 2nd at the Baraza Media Lab. I already have a short version of the film, so we can link up later and we can have a discussion. And I would love for anyone who would be interested, especially the history experts, to come and contribute their thoughts to our film. I'm working on the film with my friend. She's called Beata. She's a German journalist. Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Certainly, there's a bit of history on the Embu participation in the Mau Mau and others, the Kamba, the Luo. So, yeah, maybe not as much, not as well done, but it's not totally absent. But thank you for your observations. Yes, Justice. Oh, you. Okay, we have one more here. So just one more. Two more, and then we can ask Ms. Miyonga to respond. Thank you.
My name is Timothy Ndegwa.
Timothy, yes.
I am a rapper. Question. Would you consider, there was a question that has been asked about the academia trying to veer off the history, especially of the Indians and others. Would you consider that part of whitewash of the history through academia? Like the academia didn't pay attention to Mau Mau and tried to whitewash that part of the history.
I think we can get we'll take another round so that we don't burden our speaker too much. So you have, I think, two gentlemen. The first one from Dr. Obongi, the different spaces in which we can look at fear from the colonized, the colonizers, and of course the academia. And I think that ties to what the young scholar is asking there, right? Is it silence or is it whitewash from the academia? And Ken also talked about the interface between fear and labeling, fear of labeling. And very importantly, the methodological quandary we get into when we talk about emotions. I think to me, that is critical. Thank you.
Would you like me up here?
Yes, please.
Okay. All right. Thanks for these wonderful questions. There's a lot to think about here. So I'll start with the point that that was shared with a few different comments about silencing. I guess perhaps silence is a clumsy word. And I think I use the word silence as more of a shorthand. Perhaps the verb form is more appropriate in the sense that it's the processes of silencing or the processes of trying to suppress certain types of narrative around Mau Mau, rather than the absolute silencing. You know, throughout Kenyan post-independence history, there has been mention of Mau Mau, and it's been a consistent part of historical narrative, but in a very specific, curated way, where many voices and many sort of narratives that didn't fit into the preferred political discourse were either sidelined or silenced or not given a platform in a public space. And yeah, I agree with your point, Dr. Gachi, that silence is not necessarily agreement. And I think that was something that came up a lot in my research interviews, that people were silently disagreeing a lot of the time. Yeah, so I'm definitely appreciative of those comments and questions about silence, and keen to sort of continue to develop the nuance of what that means. Yeah, could you clarify the question about whitewashing? I'm not sure I fully understood.
What I mean, he talked about how his professor told him to veer off a certain topic. So am I the academia trying to whitewash the history, or just quiet about it? Because this Mau Mau knowledge has been coming up years, but back then it was really not being discussed.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I thought Professor Mbongi's story was really interesting. I definitely pricked my ears up, because I think it's an example of the subtle ways that history writing, history making was suppressed in a certain extent around Mau Mau. You know, it was seen as a dangerous topic to the historian and to a wider public. So yes, in answer to your question, yeah, I do think there was a process of sort of whitewashing and silencing. Yes, okay, moving on. I've written all my questions down. There are a few you asked. So another question, you were asking about the interaction between fear and labeling. I think that's a really interesting one, and it's one that I haven't really considered before. So I'm really excited to think some more about this and maybe hear your opinions as well, if you'd care to offer any insights. But my immediate response is that, you know, we talk a lot about binaries when we talk about Mau Mau, but also we see that a lot of people were walking quite a careful line and trying to find a middle space. You know, there were people who were distinctly Mau Mau and distinctly loyalist or home guard. And then there were many people who had a more fluid identity and who tried to kind of walk a careful line between those two, including, yes, Kenyatta himself, definitely. And I do think that the sort of that kind of that fear and labeling can be related in the sense that, like, walking that careful line was about fear. It's about trying to make sure that you're not stepping too far into one camp as to be condemned as either Mau Mau or home guard, depending on who your audience might be. But then also you have you could think about the idea of belonging into a certain group, or like taking a binary stance as a sort of safety, offering a safety of bringing yourself into a protective community. So yeah, thank you for that, and I'm really interested to think a bit more about that. Yeah, and then to the point of methodology, history and memory are certainly different, and you know, history in a way is sort of about disciplining the past and creating sort of reasoned understandings of what happened in the past. Memory is much more fluid and contingent, and that's a sort of an ongoing battle or an ongoing question for me as primarily an oral historian. But if you think about it, that's a question that's been a part of oral history for a long time. And, you know, the oral tradition, especially on this continent, is very strong. I think for me personally, part of what makes my methodology possible is that I'm thinking less about solid facts of why and when and how in the sense of what exactly happened, because I'm in part reliant on a very strong secondary literature, and I'm thinking more about meaning. So I'm thinking about what things mean, and I think in that sense, memory can actually be really helpful. And some of the fluidities of memory can actually enrich the work, because you can understand a lot about what people mean. I'm thinking now about Justin Willis's work on oral history, and also Louise White, who talk about ideas of rumors and of sort of untruths as part of historical sources that can allow you to create meaning and to deepen your understanding. Yeah, so I hope I answered your questions, and I look forward to some more.
Thank you very much, Ms. Miyunga. Maybe we take one more round from the ground, and then we can look at what we have online. Maybe you'd like to make a small comment. Now, the Mau Mau will not speak of the oaths to this day. For example, they do not talk about the oaths, which was a major driver of the war itself. I don't know how you would explain that within your, the fear that you're talking about. It's also my view that the memories and retellings of the Mau Mau perhaps have to be demystified in a sense, right? We need to demystify the war itself, the fighters themselves, the kind of rebellion that they carried out. Just a comment. Perhaps you'd like to comment on that. Those aspects of the rebellion that we know very little about, and not necessarily driven by fear, perhaps the mystics of the war itself. Any questions from the ground? If not, yes, there's one here.
My name is Ngugi Emmanuel, and first I'll begin by commending you for this wonderful thesis, as it explores a very unexplored part of Mau Mau history. Personally, for me, I think it's more relating. My grandfather, who comes from Karatina, Nyeri, you mentioned it. Karatina is in Nyeri, and who still lives today, has a history to tell, because he was there when Evelyn Baldwin declared a state of emergency. He was there when during the 1954 oppressive Operation Anvil, where they were sent, their fathers were sent to gulags, which we remember very well looked like the Stalin concentration camps in the 1930s, and he witnessed his own people being unleashed terror. So to me personally, I believe this is a very interesting topic for me. And nearly 40 years after Kenya purportedly gained independence, the Mau Mau was still outlawed. It was an illegal organization. It was only in 31st August 2003 when the then Kibaki president signed a gazette to give the Mau Mau a legal legitimacy. You mentioned you mentioned that the Mau Mau was lifted. The ban on Mau Mau was lifted in 2004. Personally, I think it was 2003, or perhaps you could clarify on that, because personally I'm very attentive careful on the dates. Was it 2003 or was it 2004? My question now was, and this is a question that many have asked, and one that has sparked controversy, especially among historians like British historian David Anderson, we have John Lonsdale, we have Peter Baxter, and just some of the historians who have weighed on this topic, on this question. Wow. And the question goes like this: were the Mau Mau itself a central province movement fighting for the interest of its own people, or was it a national uprising fighting for the soul of the colony to emancipate the colony from Britain's grip? So I need your opinion on the two opinions, on the two views, and also if there is a correlation between those, what is the convergence? Was it a Mau Mau focusing on its own people, or was it a national one focusing on the soul of the colony? And if there's a convergence or an intersection between those two views, I would like to know. My last question is, it took too long for the Moi and the Kenyatta regimes to legitimize Mau Mau. Apart from fear, were there any other factors that made the regimes after independence fail to legitimize the Mau Mau? Because the Mau Mau are considered a national liberation to some. Maybe they catalyze independence. So apart from fear itself, were there any other extenuating factors why the Kenyatta regime and the Moi regime failed or refused or silenced the Mau Mau? Thank you.
Thank you. Maybe you'd like to answer that, or should we take the questions? There are quite a few comments from the chat. Scroll from the beginning. Thank you very much. Edwin Manyim, I believe he's our student, says, thank you. Thanks for the presentation, Ms. Biyonga of Mau Mau. Being a very controversial subject about reevaluating archaeological knowledge, where does the archaeological aspect come in? Thank you. We have another comment. Question, it's a question actually. Are there similarities from other jurisdictions such as Zimbabwe? Very interesting. Nigeria or Ceylon? How does that compare? Secondly, what was the role of the Crown and, sorry, I can't see very well. I've lost it. And the Commonwealth in what's forgetting? What was the role of the Crown and the Commonwealth in forgetting? Let's take just one more and then you can handle this. This one which says, happy to follow from Czech Republic. I'm proud of this great department. Yay, there we are. Okay, I think let's deal with that. And then we can take perhaps one final round.
Okay, so I'll start with your question about, yeah, it's true. Some people still will not speak about certain details of Mau Mau. And there's definitely an intense secrecy around oaths. I think I could partly explain that within the fear narrative, in the sense that these oaths were bound in a way that I've been explained to in a way that would result in consequences for those who spoke about the details of the oath. Obviously, that was essential during the Mau Mau War because so much of the conflict was based around intelligence. So it was based around who knew what. You know, that's kind of a basic element of a guerrilla conflict, is that it's a lot about secrecy and tactical operations. But I also think there's something else going on there. There's a sort of powerful mystical part to it that is sort of with my kind of modern understanding is maybe not fully clear, but that there is something else. There's a core belief system, I think, that's behind these oaths and certain aspects of the sort of mystified sides of Mau Mau from a survivor perspective. And then Ngugi Emmanuel, thank you so much for your questions. I do believe that it was 2003. I think, in fact, I'll admit I'm not the best with dates. It's for a historian, it's sometimes shameful, but thank you for your correction there. Yeah, the question of whether Mau Mau was a sort of primarily a Kikuyu nationalist, perhaps peasant uprising, based in Central Province, or a national movement is sort of a key question that has been plaguing historians since the beginning of Mau Mau history, or since the beginning of Mau Mau, really. And I don't know if you'll accept this answer, but I would contend that it's both. Maybe that's me sitting on the fence, but I would say that for some people, for many people, it was an uprising based on the immediate effects of colonialism within their communities. So it was about individuals and communities within Central Province railing against the results of colonialism, the effects of colonialism, but in a more localized sense. And at the same time, there was a nationalist element to the Mau Mau movement. So I'm also interested to hear other people's opinions. I feel like this debate can continue to go on. I think for the purposes of my research, it's okay to not fully decide. And I think sometimes we can inhabit that ambiguity and understand the Mau Mau was many things for many people. And were there factors apart from fear for the Moi and the Kenyatta regimes that led to them silencing Mau Mau? I think absolutely. I think you know, historians have discussed, but I also think there's more to be discussed about, especially Kenyatta's very ambiguous relationship with Mau Mau. But in my historical understanding, Kenyatta was not a Mau Mau member. These were not sort of his people who he was indebted to or supporting necessarily. And in some ways, the type of nationalism that Mau Mau espoused was in conflict with the type of nationalism, the sort of constitutional nationalism and sort of amicable parting that Kenyatta wanted between the UK and Kenya. So in a sense, I think for Kenyatta, it was politically prudent to leave Mau Mau in the past and to inhabit a different sort of future than maybe the Mau Mau had envisioned in Kenya's post-colonial state. And, you know, in my understanding, Mau Mau had a radical redistributive politics element to it. You know, it was about the return of stolen land, for example. And that's a question, you know, land is a question we could do a whole nother webinar on land, and maybe we will another time. But, you know, for both Kenyatta and Moi, the land policies that they espoused and that they implemented were in conflict with the types of land policies that Mau Mau had advocated for, which was namely sort of a return of the stolen land, especially in central Kenya, but in other parts of the country as well. So I think that was also definitely a key part of Kenyatta and Moi's reluctance to talk about Mau Mau in public, at least. Where does the archaeology come in? I'm not so sure about that one. Maybe I've been slightly misplaced. But I hope you'll accept me anyway as an imposter in the archaeology side of the department. And similarities with other jurisdictions. Yeah, this is something I've been thinking about in terms of especially sort of post-conflict resolution or post-conflict memory in post-colonial Africa, I think there's a lot of richness that can be drawn from comparative contexts. You know, if we look at South Africa, for example, there's a vastly different way of addressing the conflicts of apartheid. You know, they have the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. They want to talk outwardly and publicly about this past and bring it absolutely to the forefront of public memory and public policy. That's in stark contradiction to somewhere like Kenya, where the truth is more something that's to be perhaps remembered, but not publicly discussed in any sort of nuanced detail. So yeah, I think a comparative perspective can be really interesting in this context. And then the role of the Crown and the Commonwealth in forgetting. Obviously, I touched in the presentation on the archival theft and destruction. And when I think about that, there's sort of two things that happen at once. There's a sort of absolute destruction of certain material that really limits the process of history making. But there's also the theft of material, which specifically affects, especially and continues to affect academics in Kenya. So you know, one of the interesting things is that a lot of the scholarship on Mau Mau comes from outside Kenya and specifically from the UK, because there's a lot more access to the surviving archival material. So in that sense, there's a sort of imbalance in the way that in the effect of the of Operation Legacy and of how that implements history making, how that affects history making, and it really disadvantages academics on the continent who, as all of you know, it's very hard to get the necessary sort of visas and funds to go and research in the National Archives in the UK. I hope that, I think that's all the questions.
I think it is. Thank you. Thank you very much. We're going to ask those online if any one of you would like to ask Ms. Mionga a question. Kindly unmute yourself so that you could ask your question. Thank you. I'm talking to the audience online. Kukubo Baraza, thank you very much. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you. And thank you, Rose, for your very elaborate presentation. My contribution is a personal experience in the period of the Mau Mau emergency. And I'm thinking about the concepts of fear and terror. I experienced it because there were the colonial army, I'm told based in Langata and Westlands, whose job it was to go around to terrorize or to create fear among people where they suspected were centers of potential trouble. Now, I happen to have been born and gone to primary school at the epicenter of Dini ya Musambwa, around Malakisi and Kolanya. And the two places close together were centers of interesting activities. Malakisi was where the Dini ya Musambwa attacked the British colonial subjects in 1948, and Kolanya is where the colonial system collected all the loyalists, the Komerera, Tugunia, and so on, for safekeeping. And so at the height of the emergency, a large group of Majoni, the army, came through the primary schools, collected us, and put us on a hillside. This is close to Mount Elgon. And demonstrated to us what would happen if we joined Dinia Musamba or joined Mau Mau. And what they did was to blow up people's houses with something called incendiary bullets, and then asked us if we liked it or not. To me, that is nothing short of terror. And in 21st century, it's called terrorism. And I think you should see that element. Don't be afraid of talking about silence, talking about fear, without talking about terrorism. Because really, what created the fear in the Mau Mau areas, particularly in central Kenya, Nakuru area, and parts of Bungoma where Dinia Musamba was nothing less than systematic state terrorism. Thank you.
Oh, thank you very much for that it's primary evidence witnessed by Kukubo Baraza. Thank you very much. I'm sure she may want to comment on that. I don't know if we have anyone else online would like to make a comment, to ask a question. Maybe we can look at the chat again and couple that with what the good doctor has said. There was one question I thought was interesting. I love your thesis. Okay, it's gone. Okay. Many thanks, Miyonga. I was just wondering, one, how study on the obviously diffuse and varied sources, causes, motivations of fear is possible. I think she's talking about the multiplicity of, causes of fear. Secondly, how this fear, in quotes, might transition from one historical period or era to another, and in what form or what forms. And thirdly, how the emotional fear that resides in those in authority versus those who are subjects might coincide, and with what consequences can they run together? The fear of the ruled and the fear of those in authority. Thank you for the presentation. That is from Naomi Kilungu. She's our student. That's a great question. I think this one is in reference to the oath. That's a great question. Locating the oath within emotionalism as part of Kikuyu cosmology. Right. My question, in view of Kakas for the Hounds by Major Mwangi, I don't know if you have read that, Ms. Mbionga, is this narration fiction? You have? Okay, yeah. It's a great novel. So thank you for the presentation. Cognizant of the psychological nature of your research, what components did your research methodology entail? Maybe perhaps the listener came in a bit late. I remember you talking a little bit about that, but perhaps you'd like to, again, quickly comment on that last one. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you for another rich set of questions. I feel like my research is being really enriched by these questions, so I'm really grateful. So first, to the person who offered, I forget his name, who offered a personal experience.
Professor Baraza.
Professor Baraza, thank you so much for sharing your personal experience. Yeah, and I definitely agree with you that what you describe is systematic state terror. I think it strikes me as ironic that so much emphasis in British propaganda was placed on the notion of Mau Mau as terrorism, while those same people were deliberately and systematically enacting terrorism within Kenya. And I think your story also speaks to sort of the intimacy of violence during Mau Mau. This was not something that was happening on faraway battlefields. This was happening within people's homes, and it encompassed the entire community, including children. And that has lasting psychological and emotional legacies, as I don't think I need to tell anyone who lived through that. Then Naomi Kilongo's question, I didn't take good notes, but there was a question about the transition of fear in different historical periods. If I understand you correctly, you're asking about sort of the transition from the Mau Mau period into the post-independence period, but maybe correct me if I'm wrong. But if that's the question, I think we need to remember that although as historians we might kind of neatly categorize historical eras, the span of a lifetime might straddle multiple historical eras. So that there's always a continuity between sort of an independence and a post-independence. So it's not this this neat period, and that's something that an idea I'm trying to develop in my research, is this kind of deconstructing this idea of a sort of line in the sand between the pre and the post-independence era. I think especially when you talk to survivors of Mau Mau in rural Kenya, and you talk about their experiences, they don't have necessarily a clear distinction, and their lives didn't radically change on day one of independence. So I think there's following these emotional threads can actually kind of help to exemplify sort of the continuity between different historical periods. And there was a question about sort of the psychological components to my research methodology. So I use sort of emotions theory to kind of understand emotions from a psychological perspective, or from a sort of neurobiological perspective. But at the same time, my methodology is really centered on more of a social and cultural understanding of emotions. So in order to do that, I really rely on my research participants to express their emotions explicitly. I try really carefully not to assume or project what I think someone might feel. So I'll always ask very clarifying questions. How did you feel? Why did you feel this way? And I'm privileged as an oral historian that I get to ask these questions and get direct answers, and kind of be quite rigorous in the way that I investigate how people feel and felt. And similarly, as I mentioned in the archives, I actually look for the words that express emotion. So again, I'm not assuming that because I have this hypothesis about emotions, that I have this hypothesis about fear, that any sort of violent action was related to fear. Instead, I'll look, and it's actually surprising how emotive a lot of archival material is. Sometimes I think of it as quite dry, but when you look into the details of language, people use the words scared, worried, concerned, anxious. So that's where I'm primarily drawing my understanding of the emotions from.
Yes.
Sorry, I've just remembered something small. This is perhaps what you might want to think about. There is a very interesting intra-Mount Kenya differences. There is an apparent dichotomy, some kind of difference between Kiambu and Nyeri. Sometimes have this thinking that this is caused in a way by Mau Mau. If so, then probably you might want to look at how fear, emotion have contributed to this dichotomy, between Nyeri and Kiambu. I know that your research is based mainly in Nyeri, but perhaps you might think of, getting ideas around how Mau Mau is remembered, feared or something like that in Kiambu. And the second part of it is how has this emotion, fear, remembering informed, state formation in Kenya's post-colony? Given that Kenya's post-colonial two presidents have come from Kiambu, Kenyatta 1 and Kenyatta 2. And Kenya's one president has come from Nyeri, and now we have a deputy president from Nyeri. Could that be related to this whole idea of remembering of Mau Mau and reconstructing it consistently in different times? It's not a question, it's something you might want to think about, and I have a feeling that it promises to be very informative, particularly given the times we have had in Kenya's post-colony. Thank you.
Very much then. It's a very interesting observation, and perhaps it's a question or two hidden in there.
All right. Thank you, Rose, for the wonderful presentation. Mine is very simple. What is the nature of Mau Mau historiography, and how does your work either fit or deviate from it? Thank you.
Thank you, Oguto. Any more questions from the ground? Comments? So one there. Thank you.
Thank you very much for a very wonderful presentation. Mine isn't a question as such, although you can jump in and maybe make a comment on it. Do you think that in the contemporary Kenya, those who feared the colonial terrorism, as Professor Kukubo said, are applying the same method to instill fear to others? I have in mind anytime there is a sort of a threat or a claim from the other part of the country, then we see the deputy president saying, I am a son of Mau Mau. Or again, we hear Honorable Ndindi Nyoro saying, I am Mau Mau proper. So you are not going to say anything to us. So do you think we are just going back to use the same terror that we are threatening, the colonial system used to send to other regions? Any comment on that? Thank you.
Masika, again, that's a very interesting observation and question. Any more questions? I think there is one there.
Hello, my name is Avtar Singh and I'm from India. I want to know about Makhan Singh. Is there any relation between Mau Mau and with Makhan Singh? Do you know about Makhan Singh?
I can say something.
Okay.
I can say something.
Ken, I think for the second one, the last question, you are the expert on India. You may, and Kenyan Indians, you may want to comment on that. Let's begin with Ken, and then we go to our presenter.
All right. Thank you, Avtar. Welcome to our seminar this afternoon. Avtar is also a PhD student from Patiala University in Punjabi in India. Makhan Singh was a very strong trade unionist in Kenya in the last years of the colonial period. And he worked very closely with the likes of Tom Mboya, one of the leading African unionists of the time. But one thing that distinguishes Makhan Singh from the rest of the revolutionaries associated with Mau Mau is that the colonial government had a certain special fear against Makhan Singh. And at some point, there was a feeling that there is a role which Makhan Singh and Ampu Patel and Githaral Vidyati that I talked about earlier played in infusing nationalist feelings towards the Africans who were in the forefront in this. And he ended up being captured by the colonial government and became the longest Mau Mau detainee, actually. He was detained for 11 years. And then after that, he was deported to India. So Makhan Singh was the longest Mau Mau detainee in Kenya at the time. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ken. The potency of fear used against the trade unionists in Kenya.
Okay. Thanks, Professor Mbongi, for helping me out on that one and also for your questions. So with regards to the Kiambu-Nyeri dichotomy, it's true, yes. yes, it's true that this exists. And as you point out, my research is mainly based in Nyeri, so I haven't been thinking about this so much or addressing it. But it's definitely something to consider. And yeah, your question about how emotions sort of informed the state formation in Kenya's post-colony, I'm going to combine that with the last question about sort of Mau Mau in contemporary Kenya. I think there's a lot of discussion about sort of who is the real Mau Mau and people using Mau Mau and the emotions that it invokes in terms of fear, in terms of pride, and in terms of sort of galvanizing a voting public. What's interesting with Mau Mau in contemporary politics is that for the most part, the politicians claiming Mau Mau status are too young to be Mau Maus. So what that shows is there's sort of Mau Mau has such a potent and mythological power that actually you don't need to be a Mau Mau in order to invoke it and use it in your political goals, which is striking and interesting to me. And oh yes, Justice, your question about Mau Mau historiography. As I mentioned, you know, I'm really on the shoulders of giants here in the sense that Mau Mau historiography is a really rich field. The earlier historiography engages a lot in the debate that we've touched upon here about what was the nature of Mau Mau, whether and how it had sort of political nationalist legitimacy. You know, Kanogo's work on Mau Mau as a peasant revolt versus work that looked at Mau Mau as a nationalist movement. Those early debates, I think, sort of set the stage for me to kind of take a different route and look at different questions. And then later discussion, especially after the declassification of archival evidence has focused a lot on the British counterinsurgency, on the brutality and violence that happened, and on sort of the early processes of concealment of that violence as well. And I guess I build on that work in the sense that I'm looking at the way that these processes, especially the way that the brutality and violence was historicized, and the way it was discussed in post-independence Kenya. So in a way, I'm asking questions about the early historiography and the way that Mau Mau was historicized, and also at a grassroots level, the way that it was remembered. I think sort of my deviations, obviously, I'm bringing in a kind of new methodological question about emotions, and then I'm also trying to understand Mau Mau at the grassroots in a way that other researchers have done, but I think my innovation is that I'm trying to do it by looking at memory as sort of a subject as well as a source, rather than kind of using memories of Mau Mau specifically to sort of extract facts. I'm trying to understand where memory and history meet. I think that was all the questions.
I do not know if there are any further questions, any comments before we close off. Yes.
Thank you for your presentation. My question.
Introduce yourself, sir.
My name is Makao Kitata. I'm a colleague of Ken. I teach literature in this university, and my question is exactly related to literature performance. We know that the Mau Mau and their descendants were very expressive people, very creative people who fought the war using art. In your research, have you managed to deal with that aspect of emotion, the way they were putting their emotions in art forms and using that as a weapon against colonialism? What do you have to say?
Great question. I'm thinking of the Mau Mau songs, for example, the prayers, the oaths. I think that's a very interesting way to look at it, the question we're dealing with. Maybe you'd like to comment on that.
And the way movie has captured it in a number of his works.
Indeed. Yes. Just a minute, we have one more question.
Thank you for the good presentation. My name is Peter Mnyoto. I'm a student in the History and Archaeology department. I was just wondering, when you're talking about the emotions, specifically about fear, whether during your interaction with the respondents or the interviewees, were there any comments that about fear as a result of weapons used by the British government on the Mau Mau? The reason why I'm saying this is 70 years down the line, we are still recovering, especially bombs that were dropped during the state of emergency, up to as 2 weeks ago. I heard you mention the Mukroini. There was a bomb that was recovered on Saturday. So I don't know whether during the interaction there was such comments. Thank you.
I think now we allow you to respond to those
All
two
right.
questions and we close the session.
Okay.
Thank you.
Two great questions. So yeah, the question about literature and performance and emotions, I think is a really important one. And it's something that I'm hoping to weave into my thesis as it progresses. You know, as historians, sometimes we can shy away from the more expressive forms of primary sources, but I think that especially when we're looking at emotions, they can be really powerful. So yeah, as Dr. Gachis mentioned, songs is really important. And it's one of the songs are one of the sort of the most readily available of kind of Mau Mau authored literature, as it were, or Mau Mau authored arts that are still available. There's quite a vast archive of recorded songs. It's scattered, but it's really interesting to explore both the nature of the songs, and I think, as I mentioned in the presentation, sort of how those songs were actually suppressed because they were believed to be dangerous. And one of the things that's really interesting to me about songs is that in almost every single interview that I've conducted, participants end up singing. There's something really powerful about songs in evoking emotion and invoking memory. And in other art forms, I've been looking at the sculpture work of Edward Njenga, and he produced a set of sculptures depicting daily life in detention. And I actually found something quite interesting recently in the archive, in the National Archives here, relating to that sculpture, where Njenga writes to Kenyatta and says, I've made these sculptures depicting daily life in detention. Could you come and view them as part of the Independence Day celebrations? And Kenyatta's personal secretary responds, well, we'll think about it, but might I suggest that you add a sculpture of Kenyatta into your selection, which I think is interesting because it speaks to the way that in that early post-independence period, Kenyatta was kind of inserting himself into history of Mau Mau, where he actually didn't belong, and kind of trying to intervene also in sort of artistic expressions. And then, of course, most famous, we have Ngugi, who, again, if we think about sort of suppression of artistic expression, he's really important. But more than that, he's important because he offers a deeply personal experience that says something about also about sort of a universal emotional experience of Mau Mau. I recently got to see the revival of I Will Marry When I Want, and even all this time later, it's a very galvanizing work. It's highly emotional, and you can kind of see why it felt dangerous to politicians. I think, as you point out, art is very powerful, and it sometimes cuts much closer than history can. So yeah, I really welcome your contribution, and I'm interested in how I can include it in the thesis. Oh yeah, and finally, your question, Peter. Yes, I have actually heard some comments about weapons and fear. One interview particularly strikes me, which is about airplane bombers. So I was interviewing a woman, and she said she was talking about the bombs that were dropped from planes during the Mau Mau counterinsurgency, and she told me that the other day she'd heard an airplane fly over her house, and she was so scared that she ran and hid under the bed, because I guess she was so sort of still kind of deeply traumatized by that type of violence and by those specific weapons. And I think especially bombs kind of evoke a very specific kind of fear. So yeah, thanks for that question.
So thank you very much. That was the most interactive session, and we are very grateful for your presentation and your effort to answer the questions and concerns from the room. Thank you very much. Thank you. We'll have Joseph give us a vote of thanks.
Right, ladies and gentlemen, good evening, good afternoon, good morning, depending on your time, your time frame. I want to give special thanks to our wonderful presenter, Ms. Rose Mionga. She has indeed given us a new perspective of understanding Mau Mau war and experiences of the same. I also like to thank Dr. Gachi for the wonderful moderation of the session. We really enjoyed it, particularly I've learned a lot about Mau Mau this afternoon. Our chair, thank you so much for organizing the workshop. Now, to our online audience and our physical audience as well, thank you for being part of this academic process. Now, I would like to call upon our chair to give a few closing remarks. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you, Joseph, and thank you, Maggie, for that. We end the session here, but I'll ask the members of staff to remain behind and our administrator for a few things here and there. Thank you.